All right. Yeah, thank you.
So very nice to meet you, Dr. Tran. Okay, so please let me start this webinar.
Sure, yes.
So hello, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar, Bystanders, Digital Activism and Revolution Solidarity in Myanmar's Democratic Struggles. Firstly, introducing myself as Julia, I'll be responsible for hosting this webinar today, and thank you all for being with us on this webinar. It's my honor to introduce our special guest, Dr. Tran, postdoctoral researcher at the Nordic Institute of ASEAN Studies and Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen. She studies contentious politics and digital cultures and authoritarianism in Myanmar. She has also worked with civil society organizations in Myanmar to coordinate research on local governance, digital literacy, and online disinformation. Her academic research is published in Fokami at the ASEAN Journal of Comparative Politics and Journal of Contemporary Asia. Along with her experiences today, she will also discuss Myanmar's current political struggles by comparing with international contexts. And this talk will last about 1.5 hours, and there will be a question and answer session at the end. So we would appreciate if you hold your questions till the discussion time. For your information, a recorded version of this webinar will also be available on YouTube as soon as possible. So as the time comes to start our webinar, I'm glad to welcome you again, Dr. Tran, to discuss the today's topic.
All right. Thank you very much, Julia, for such a generous introduction. And once again, thank you very much for inviting me here to give this talk and for hosting this talk. And secondly, I would also like to thank everybody who are attending the talk virtually or tuning in from elsewhere. And I understand that, I really appreciate your participation, even though you might be busy with different types of activities and initiatives in the ongoing struggle for a more democratic and peaceful Myanmar. And also in the midst of, this ongoing sufferings as well by different communities at the hands of the atrocity by the Myanmar military. So once again, I just like to express my gratitude for your attendance today. And I hope I'll try my best to make sure that I'm not wasting your time. So as Julia said, most of, we appreciate if you reserve your comments and questions to the end. However, during my presentations, if there are any points that you find unclear, you can also, I think, leave some kind of comments in the chat box anonymously as well. And then I will try my best to answer, right, some of those questions and to clarify points from my presentation. And today I will talk, I probably won't take up the whole hour, maybe about 45 minutes or so. And then after that, we can have plenty of time for your questions and your comments on my research, as well as, for, mutual discussion as well. So yeah, it's such an honor for me to be able to be here and connect with all of you. So with that said, let me share my PowerPoint very quickly. And I hope that you could all see my screen. All right. So yeah, so as Julia said, at the current moment, I am a postdoctoral researcher at the Nordic Institute of Asian Studies and Department of Political Science at the University of Copenhagen. And before this position, before I started my position here, I have also already been conducting research on Myanmar, especially in terms of its various democratic struggles. And my experience with research here has been spanning for about 10 years. And during those 10 years with different types of research projects, one question that has been guiding my research interest has been about how the different contentious movements in Myanmar, both in terms of movements in urban as well as in rural or border areas, have been able to sustain themselves, have been able to stay resilient, as well as have been able to be successful, right? To achieve a certain level of success despite repressive political environment. And in order to study, this question, I also need to look at, the comparable experiences in other cases, right, of hostile political system similar to the case of Myanmar. So I hope that I could share some of those comparative insights today with you all. And I think that this might not come as a surprise to you, but if you have had a chance to read some of the works that I have published, you could see that actually I consider Myanmar to be a case that with a very impressive level of resilience of pro-democracy campaigns compared to other cases in similarly hostile environment. Right, and so throughout my research on Myanmar, there have been three main factors that that I have found to be very important in terms of sustaining or in terms of enabling success for democratic struggles. First, in terms of thinking about the role of bystanders, right? People that are ordinary and are not participating directly into contentious activities. Second is just think about the role of digital capacity of activists. Especially now in this day and age, right, where all types of different political activities are intertwined with the digital world. And last but not least is to think about the role of intergroup solidarities, right, among different communities, especially in societies that are divided as the Myanmar society. Right. So so if we look at the current literature on movement resilience under hostile political environments, then most of the literature, they have pointed to the important role of activists, of the survival and continued commitment of veteran activists. So these types of veterans, grassroots activists who have been able to survive state repression and who are committed to continue with the movement, why do they play an important role? And I think that, like from the experience of Myanmar, we already know, right, that they either lead or participate in subsequent cycles of contention, or they could also pass down their practical knowledge as well as ideological inspiration to the next generation as well. Nonetheless, like in society, as in a political system similar to Myanmar, where authoritarian regimes have zero tolerance policy toward the opposition, this would make for a very hostile environment that are difficult for these types of veteran activists, right, to persevere. And if we look at similar cases to Myanmar, for example, if we look at studies that have been done on contemporary China, then we can see that most of these studies have only highlighted the various innovations and adaptations by activists to avoid attention by the state, right, or to try to avoid or evade, a potential repression or surveillance monitoring by the government. But none of these types of studies could tell us about how activists could actually manage to survive state repression, right, like at the moment, at the height of, for example, protest crackdowns, right, and different kind of arrest campaigns, right. So so this is a big gap in terms of, like what we see in terms of other cases, around the world. And and at the same time, if we look at the case of, the history of the urban pro-democracy movement in Myanmar, then we also find that this is actually quite impressive and also puzzling how it has been able to stay resilient for so long. And throughout, the different decades since 1962 until now, right, we have witnessed how different mobilization resources have lived on, either, right, in terms of knowledge, or in terms of different networks, right, among the activists. And these veterans activists who escaped repression, they also worked with new generations of activists as well, in order to stage new rounds, right, like of resistance against dictatorship. So in order to really understand how these different activists and activist groups and activist networks have been able to sustain themselves, I take a different approach compared to what has been written, right? What has been studied, and instead of focusing on just the activists themselves, I wanted to look at the larger environment surrounding them, and I do that by tracing, the changing environment, right? Like between 1988 and 2010, especially, so I start, the starting point would be the very popular and historical 4/8 or the 8888 uprising in 1988, which originally led by student activists, right, against the dictatorship of General Ne Win, and later on was joined by other groups of activists as well. And in particular, I looked at the role of bystanders, or people that do not directly participate, do not directly adhere or support the different kind of political activities, right, either by the regime or by the opposition. And I look at the role of these bystanders both, like at the height of the protest events, as well as later on, right, like during crackdowns, especially, at moments such as the military coup that was staged by General Salmon, right, like in September 1988. Yeah, and then I also traced, right, like how these different like activist networks, how they survived, and how they were able to stage like new rounds of contention in the 1990s, in the 2000s, and the end point of my research was at what I would consider to be the last major urban pro-democracy protests in Myanmar, before political liberalization in 2010, right, which was the Saffron Revolution led by the Buddhist monks in 2007, right, against the military rule by General Dan Shui. And of course, like later on, we also find that these monks were also joined in, right, like by different groups of civilians and activists as well. And similarly to 1988, I also looked at the role of bystanders here at the height of violent crackdown, and how they responded toward these popular protests, and how did they form perception about the protesters, right? And how did that translate into their reactions, right? And different types of activities, like at the height of crackdown against protest events in urban areas in 2007. So then here, in particular in the research that I would like to share with you today, in particular, I would like to highlight, one of my findings, which is on the under-analyzed role of civilian bystanders and their high-risk protection toward protesters at the height of state violence. So the images that you see here are actually, like from the scenes, after the military coup, right, in 2021. Of course, because, I would not be able to find, similar types of images in 1988 or in 2007. However, while there might be, like some types of inadequate parallel, right, between these moments. I think that these are representative visualizations for you to imagine what I would like to emphasize, right? So here you think about different types of, for example, medical assistance, right, like by volunteers or doctors, etc. Yes. Right. So one of the and I think that for people that are attending today, you're of course you are very familiar with the scenes, with the types of images that I just showed, right, like on the previous slide. But what I would like to stress here is to think about how the majority of the population, right, how they think about political engagement and the different types of risk that are associated with their perception of political dissent, and how different types and how that might actually discourage people, right, to actively or to directly participate in contentious activities, and how these the very same ordinary residents might be very willing to engage in other types of activities that are also just as high risk, right, as participating in protests, or different types of resistance campaigns. But at the same time, right, when they conceptualize, these types of activities as non-political, and when there is certain types of moral motivations, right, that are inspiring, these protective acts, then people would actually have a very, little regard for their own personal physical risk. Yeah. So I think, once again, I think, another way to encapsulate my argument and my finding here would be to think about how citizens in general, like in under either in Myanmar or elsewhere in other repressive regimes, the majority of them, the large majority of them, they might hold grievances against the regime, but they are rarely willing to openly challenge the regime due to perceptions of high risk, right, or low efficacy. So low efficacy is thinking about, the low level of potential success, right? And I call these people bystanders, right, who are not concerned about or adhere to the agenda of either the state or the challengers. And yet these are the types of people that, despite their political withdrawal, they still might be morally motivated to engage in high-risk protection toward protesters who they perceive purely as innocent victims of unjust violence. Right. So then this is also opening up new potentials for contentious movements under repressive regime to think about, the types of populations that they could also reach out to, that they could also elicit sympathy from, right, in order to receive a larger scale of support from this population of bystander, which I would argue, even in cases of very popular struggles, such as in the case of Myanmar, these types of bystanders still exist, and it's important for us to also think about them as well. Right. And so what I did, just very quickly in terms of my own research, how did I come up with this kind of finding? How can I back up, my argument? So what I did is that I conducted oral history interviews within the semi-structured form, which means that I came up with, a list of questions. But at the same time, I was also quite flexible in terms of my interviews, and also I let my interviewees lead the conversation. And I collected, on top of that, I also collected written accounts by more than 100 Myanmar residents from diverse demographic and political backgrounds who either witnessed or were involved in two major protest events in 1988 and 2007, and why this is, like giving me, these new insights compared to what we already know, is because this type of data set represents a large number of voices from ordinary and non-contentious general public from a wide range of social economic backgrounds. And and these are just some of the graphs to show you in terms of the diversity of the people that I have interviewed in terms of their age, sex, their occupation. And you could also see that on top of that, right, like there's also diversity in terms of the number of people that did not organize or did not participate in either of these two popular protest events, but they were also they were only acting as observers, right? And to be able to reach out to this population, I mostly worked with private schools and libraries and institutions in Yangon during 2017 and 2018 in order to collect my data. Yes, and then this whole protocol at the time, I think I was also fortunate because, as you know, during 2017 and 2018, the issues of pro-democracy protests and movements in the 1980s, right, 1990s and the 2000s have become somewhat, more openly discussed, right? Various types of activists, right, that have gone on international and domestic media outlets to talk about their experiences, right, both in terms of their experiences of mobilizing people as well as experiences of repression by the military as well. So therefore, the political risk of the people that I interviewed was essentially was quite minimal at the time. But of course, I had to make sure that all of the interviewees are kept anonymous. There are certain types of issues that people might raise in terms of the risk that the interviewees might memorize or might recall events in an incorrect way due to various factors, right? Not least the passing of time. So in order to make sure that the different evidence that back up my arguments are solid, I also triangulated these accounts with other sources of published information, including reports, right, like from state media, from the government in exile, and different international human rights organizations as well. So overall, what I find, right, so just to give you an overview, this graph would show you the different types of forms of bystander protection, like from my research and, the different channels via which they would act in order to enable not only the survival of the activists, but also the long-term commitment of these activists later on after they survive repression as well, either by diminishing repressive capacity by the state, by the military, or via enabling the escape of these activists, right? And through that, like they also enhanced the activist perception of contributing toward public good and motivating them to stay committed to the pro-democracy movement for the longer run. Once again, I think that these different acts of protection, they are not surprising to you. You might have witnessed, these acts, right, like on a very regular basis, and I don't need to go into them. What I would like to stress more is in terms of to think particularly in terms of first of all, right, to think about the under-analyzed roles of bystanders, people that might not be actively contributing towards either the activist agendas, right, or the regime agenda, but at the same time, right, they can still perform certain types of activities that have long-term and consequential political meanings for the dynamics of the democratic struggles. And you know, it's important to think about you know, different ways that for a repressed movement to think about what are the different ways, right? Like to reach out to such population, and also to engender or to elicit sympathy and perception from bystanders, you know, about how they could change the bystanders' perceptions, right, like of protesters as innocent victims of unjust violence amidst a very active attempt by the military to vilify, right, and to frame protesters as terrorists, right, as rioters, and as threats to neighborhoods across the country. So that you know, would be where I would probably you know, stop for now in terms of you know, my argument about the role of bystander, and thinking about how to activate, you know, like support from the bystander population. And then next, what I would like to share next is to think about the role of activist digital capacity, right? So since 2000, I mean, even before the political liberalization in 2010, different activist groups like in Myanmar, they already had, you know, like certain that they already developed certain types of capacity in utilizing digital tools, you know, like for their political agenda. And so here, you know, now that we are in 2021, it's very important for us to also think about how pro-democracy activism could stay resilient and could even reach success, right, in the digital age. So in order to answer that question, I actually try to address two sub-questions. The first sub-question is, how does pro-democracy activism unfold differently in the digital age, like compared to the non-digital age, right? And secondly, what factors might enable its resilience and success? And in order to look at cases and analyze the situation in Myanmar, I also look at other comparable cases. And I would argue that the comparable situations would exist in regimes where the authorities are able to engage in targeted instead of broad-based digital repression. Right. So what do I mean by targeted versus broad-based digital repression? So, for example, you could look at, you know, if you think about China or Russia, then they would belong to the universe of regimes with broad-based digital repression capacity. Whereas if you think about other cases, such as if you think about, for example, Thailand or Cambodia, or even like outside of Asia, if you think about Tunisia, right, or Hungary, these are the types of regimes which I argue are the majority of authoritarian regimes in the world right now are only able to engage in targeted digital repression, despite the fact that they might very well want to emulate what China and Russia are doing, right? So, so first of all, right, a very quick overview in terms of what does it mean for the operating environment of pro-democracy activists. So, under a broad-based digital authoritarianism, we might see a very sophisticated firewall technology that could, you know, that could block content on a large scale, right, from entering the domestic internet, and that could also slow cross-border traffic. At the same time, we could also find that these regimes are have been able to create national search engines, social networks, and email servers that compete with foreign and private web services for users. On the other hand, right, like for targeted for authoritarian regimes with ability for targeted digital repression, what we're more likely to see is in terms of physical violence and legal coercion against digital activists, selective internet shutdowns, bans on foreign websites, and limited connectivity. And at the same time, right, when they try to flood the internet with contents, they are not able to create these types of national search engines or social networks. But what they do would be more likely to spread propaganda and disinformation campaigns on existing platforms in order to compete with unwanted content for viewers' attention. So under the environment of targeted digital repression, there are still space, of course, right? Compared to broad-based repression, there is still a certain existence, right, like of activist space where dissidents, they could build up, they could develop digitalized capacity in order to in order to further their campaigns, right? So how does this look differently from pro-democracy activism, right, before the digital age? Here I would argue that we need to pay attention to two new aspects. First of all, the repertoire or strategies that would be effective in the digital world now would need to be digitally secure, hybrid, or online strategies, right? Either in terms of running online or hybrid campaigns, or in terms of running different types of hybrid types of activities targeting different types of stakeholders. Secondly, I would also argue that, compared to, beside the types of activism that these dissidents like might wage, right, on conventional issues such as free speech or advocating for minority rights or anti-civil war against the target, which is might be the state or the military at the same time, right? They they also need to be involved in another type of resistance, which is resistance against digital authoritarian abuse, and that actually includes a completely different set of activities, right? So not only thinking about online and hybrid campaigns such as Facebook events or live streaming or the use of hashtags or the use of private messaging apps to coordinate activities. They also need to think about how to also coordinate advocacy toward online platforms, either private or foreign platforms, right? In order to push these platforms to have a stricter content moderation that would restrict disinformation from the regime. And at the same time, right, beyond advocacy, these activists also need to pay attention to conducting either hybrid or online training on digital security toward journalists and other activists as well, right? So in the research that I'm currently conducting together with Megan Ryan, who is a PhD candidate at the Department of Political Science at the University of Michigan, as well as other Burmese researchers. What we have found in our research is that under the environment of targeted digital repression, the more that activists could develop these capacities, right, both in terms of resistance against digital authoritarian abuse, as well as on other conventional issues with hybrid or online tactics, then the more that they are able to develop these capacity ahead of time, in a more liberal period, then the more likely that after the regime is turning more authoritarian or more autocratic, that these capacity could continue to enable other or the same activists or new activists, right, to stage resilient resistance against autocratization and against the backsliding of democracy. Yes. So this diagram encapsulates the main argument that Megan and I we argue in our current research. So once again, right? If we think particularly in terms of the case of Myanmar, right, then the type of experience in digitalized pro-democracy activism that has been developed between 2010 and 2020 plays an important role in terms of limiting the backsliding of democracy, right, after the military coup in 2021, either by enabling platforms' removal of autocrats' online content, or by enabling resistance actors' ability to safely and discreetly operate online. And last but not least, by also facilitating the proliferation and innovations in resistance tactics, right, in terms of discrediting and debunking disinformation by the military, and also in terms of mobilizing and coordinating activities on the ground. And so once again, there are these various parts, right? Different parts to the to understand the puzzle, right, of how pro-democracy struggles could stay resilient or could be successful under repressive digital authoritarianism. I think that these are all important factors that we should pay attention to. Yeah. And so to illustrate our argument in more concrete form, I'm sure that most of you are familiar with how between 2010 2020 there has already been a certain level of digital authoritarianism in Myanmar, right? In the period of semi-authoritarian rule, we have seen an increase in terms of using 66D in the telecommunication law in order to persecute dissidents or independent journalists. At the same time, we have also seen efforts, right, like by the authorities in order to impose internet shutdowns in certain parts of active conflict in Western Myanmar. And last but not least, there were active attempts in terms of spreading disinformation against the Rohingya population with various types of dangerous speech and hate speech during 2012, all the way in the lead up, right, like to the election in 2020 as well. And exactly, like during this time, right, where there are certain level of political openness, and yet, there are still ongoing forms of digital repression. The various groups of human rights activists and pro-democracy activists in Myanmar, this is, I would say, in a way, was an ideal setting for them to develop capacity that later on, right, like could be utilized and could be refined for anti-coup resistance. So first of all, we saw the increase in terms of the use of online and hybrid campaign and the use of different hashtags in order to oppose against 66D or against internet shutdown in the western part of the country. We have also seen how different types of activist groups are able to promote their offline protests, right, with using different types of hashtags or tags, right, on public platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. And on top of that, we have also seen how different organizations and journalists develop capacity to debunk and discredit disinformation from the military in real time. Last but not least, various digital rights activist groups have also been very effective in terms of in their first attempt to reach out to platforms such as Facebook, right, in order to condemn their content moderation regarding hate speech against the Rohingya, and in order to advocate for more Burmese content moderators in order to improve and create a safer online space for dissidents and for marginalized groups within Myanmar. And all of these types of experimenting, right, all of these kind of first steps developing a more sophisticated repertoire of resistance against digital authoritarianism, play a very important role in terms of enabling, in what we find in terms of enabling a more resilient anti-coup resistance in 2021. Right. So as I said, right, there's no surprise, right? The day after the coup, we saw the proliferation of various types of online campaigns on Facebook, on Twitter, etc. And Facebook, due to their long-term engagement with Myanmar civil society, they also a week later they also started to ban Myanmar military pages, and also become like a very active in terms of monitoring these kind of pro-military content. On top of that, right, we also see that the military employing very similar types of digital repression tactics that we have seen before 2020, right, such as internet shutdown, right, now all over the country for certain periods of time, as well as their effort to flood different online platforms with their disinformation, right. And so being already familiar with dealing with these types of tactics are also quite important, as the various digital rights and human rights activist groups in Myanmar, they were able to disseminate tips for activists and journalists to stay digitally secure right the day right after the coup, and after that we're also able to share different types of knowledge, right, in terms of how to effectively resist against digital authoritarianism. Yeah, and so we also try to really assess how these types of activism are effective in the online world. So we, Megan and I, and our group of Burmese researchers, we also collected the most viral Burmese language public Facebook posts on a daily basis using CrowdTangle since March 2021. And some of the analysis that I will share with you today would be based on a random sample of 5,200 posts between March and May, about like 3 months right after the coup. So what we see, right? We argue that without such active strategies of resisting against digital authoritarianism on multiple fronts before the coup, we would not be able to witness what we are seeing right now, which is the proliferation of pro-resistance content on Facebook and the minimal amount of pro-military content, in contrast to pro-resistance content, right? And furthermore, it's also even more interesting to see that there is a much higher rate of pro-military content being removed on Facebook compared to pro-resistant content being removed, right? So if we think about if you know, the military in Myanmar, if they are actually very successful, right, in terms of imposing digital repression, we should see the opposite. However, I think, you know, like what we argue here is because of the long-term engagement of civil society in Myanmar with Facebook, that has actually enabled, you know, the much higher rate of removal of pro-military content compared to pro-resistant content. Right. And then last but not least, we also find that various types of similar strategies to discredit the military, right, are being applied and also being refined, you know, after the coup as well, right, such as promotion of different types of content that mock the military for example, 505A, right, or in terms of, you know, commending different types of resistance acts despite heavy repression and heavy crackdown by the military. On top of that, right, we also find, you know, these actors utilizing different types of existing knowledge about either resistance elsewhere around the world, right, or in terms of using very similar repertoire in order to amplify various types of sufferings, right, by dissident groups in Myanmar after the coup. Yeah, and here, like we also see very much these types of digital resistance tactics following the same theme in terms of coordinating offline activity using online posters and online announcements. Yes, and last but not least, it's also quite important that these various posts, they actively follow and also praise the success of street protests, right, or attacks like by ethnic revolutionary groups in the border areas as these events happen, in order to you know, inspire further dissident activities in a timely manner. So yeah, so I think that overall, you know, there are various types of implications from our research finding, but some of the main ones that I would like to stress here would be to think about, you know, first of all, the importance of you know, what we said before, right, of the different aspects to digitalize pro-democracy activism that are important to maintain and to develop, right, in order to sustain pro-democracy struggles on the ground. And secondly, via, you know, this research, we also hope to show how, despite the fact that most types of online activities might have moved to more private messaging apps and platforms, public social media platforms such as Facebook can still play a very important role in terms of mobilizing and in terms of inspiring you know, various acts of you know, democratic promotion on the ground. All right. So with that, I would like to move toward, you know, the last part in terms of the ongoing research that we are trying to conduct. So Myanmar, I think, is not only a very interesting case to look at in terms of digital resistance, but at the same time, there is, an elephant in the room, another very important factor that we also need to discuss here, which is thinking about the divisions among different communities that live in what we now know as the country of Myanmar, right? And it's very important for us to ask how the different revolutionary forces among these divided communities can develop solidarity and stay together and struggle together. And so if we look at the existing literature, right, then we can find that the common experience of suffering from political repression might motivate divided communities to join force in order to overthrow their shared oppressor. And there are various types of examples from other cases around the world as well. But the decisions for a certain group to form alliances with other groups are far from straightforward, right? They not only do they need to consider the resources and capacity of other groups, but they also need to consider whether the other groups actually have shared visions of political outcomes. And in addition, this is not only a one-off result, right? So solidarity building is an ongoing process where coalition members need to continuously forge a strong sense of common goals and to resolve long-established distrust. So these are very important factors. Otherwise, their alliances also might fail to provide a coherent alternative to the incumbent regime's political ideology and leadership. And that is the reason why, like, most of the time, when democratic struggles might lead to authoritarian breakdown, it actually is less successful in terms of ushering in like new eras of democracy. On the other hand, authoritarian breakdowns are more likely to be followed by another authoritarian regime. All right. So there is a question here in terms of why I didn't hide the names of the people who posted the content because Myanmar is at high risk even on social media. So they are a little bit concerned for the post owners for this research. So thank you very much for your concern. So in my own research, I have chosen to hide the identity of authors of posts who are not public figures. So people who are public figures and also are very prominent, such as thinking about different sources of prominent independent media from Myanmar. These types of posts, they are quite visible, so therefore, I also didn't think that there would be a high level of risk. But at the same time, right, if you think that this is the case, I would also, be very open, like if, after this this webinar is recorded, if the organizer would want to hide, the names of these organizations as well. But in my own kind of research, right, we, of course, like we do make sure that we do not post, the identity of people that are ordinary users. To make sure that they could stay safe and secure. But of course, right, if it poses any kind of issue, please feel free to edit out their identity. Thank you for your question. All right. Okay. So yeah. So then again, if we think about building solidarity among these divided communities, this is actually a very difficult question. Yes. Okay. There's another question, and I would like to address that later. But thank you for posing it. And I have actually also tried to look at this literature, like trying to look at whether, there are answers for building solidarity among divided communities, right? So if we look at the works that examine how diverse coalitions might persevere or address internal injustices and build substantial consensus beyond the lowest common denominator, these works are quite far and few in between, which means that, a piece of bad news here is that we don't have that many answers for this question. However, I think that it is still important, right? Like to look at what answers are already there, and what kind of insight that might provide for us. Like if we look at the case of revolution in Myanmar after the coup. So in a recent and also a rare review of scholarship on how dissidents build in intercommunal solidarity, this review also underscores three main contributing factors: the availability of shared neutral space, ongoing interactions, and the presence of social ties and or bridge builders, right? And the author of the review shows that coalition members, with the help of brokers, can promote unity via ongoing intergroup interactions over shared neutral spaces, including social media. Nonetheless, if we look at this kind of literature, then there are still quite some limitations, right? First of all, we need to understand, and the literature doesn't really tell us why would one group even develop an interest in forming an alliance with another group that they do not traditionally trust. And I think this has a lot of implications for the current situation in Myanmar, right? So first of all, we need to think about what might inform a group's perceived need for an alliance. Second, we need to think about what long-held divisions between groups are easier to overcome than others. And last but not least, how do group members form perceptions of other groups' beneficial capacity and resources if their communication is restricted on the ground, right, with ongoing violence and struggles. Secondly, by conceptualizing these contentious groups as unitary actors, this literature also fails to demonstrate the important mechanisms of building interest in solidarity within each groups, right? So how can the interest in terms of building solidarity might permeate from the leadership to the grassroots, or from a pro-alliance faction of the group to other factions that might not be very supportive of building up an alliance. And last but not least, the claim that social media acts as a neutral space also needs further problematization. First of all, might social media merely reproduce and reinforce intergroup power dynamics on the ground? That is something that we don't know. And on the other hand, could these platforms actually enable alternative discourses that are more supportive of reconciliation to surface and to spread in order to generate group sympathy for one another? So these are all very important questions that unfortunately I'm not able to find answers in terms of the existing literature on other cases. And at the same time, I would like to I'd like to emphasize that these are important in terms of thinking about the future of the democratic struggles in Myanmar.